Bill Finger co-created Batman. Batman has made over $30 billion. Bill Finger died broke. Joe Shuster co-created Superman. At 61 years old, he was working as a janitor, destitute, blacklisted from the comics industry, and begging DC for financial support. And this isn't just the distant past. Of the $170 million spent to make Captain America the Winter Soldier, not $1 went to the creators of the Winter Soldier. In fact, they were turned away at the movie's premiere. So why does this keep happening? And why does it seem to happen so frequently in comics specifically? Well, the answer is a bit more complicated than you might imagine, and to find out, we're going to look at a few of the key battles between creators and big companies, from the early days of comics right up into the battles that are still being fought today. The year is 1975. The Superman movie is going into production, and it's going to be the highest budget movie ever made. And across the desk of every major news organization comes a 9-page, single-spaced press release. The theme of that press release? That the creator of Superman has put a curse on the movie. Jerry Siegel was the original writer of Superman, and he and his co-creator Joe Shuster were both 61 and broke, Siegel working as a typist and Shuster a janitor. Neither were going to make a cent from the movie. After years of legal battles, they had run out of options to try and get paid by DC, and so they turned to the public for support. But let's back up. How did we get to that point? In 1933, while in high school, Siegel and Shuster came up with the idea of Superman. Over the next few years, they would refine the idea and pitch it to various publishers, all of whom rejected it. Finally, in 1938, the fledgling DC Comics agreed to run a Superman story in their new anthology called Action Comics. And Superman, as you may have guessed, was a huge hit. It started the superhero craze that persists until today and became the foundation of the shared DC universe. For the 13-page story that introduced Superman, and for the copyright to that character, Siegel and Shuster were paid $130. Now, let's talk quickly about copyright. In American law, the person who creates something owns the copyright to it, meaning for roughly 100 years, they control how their creation is used. One of the main ways copyright holders make money is through licensing, giving companies the right to use their creation in books, movies, video games, toys, whatever, in exchange for money. But Siegel and Shuster didn't license Superman to DC. They assigned DC the copyright, which means DC was able to publish the comics and license Superman without paying Siegel and Shuster a dime. For years, things were good for Siegel and Shuster because they were employed to write more Superman stories, and they were paid well for that, although their resentment built up as they realized just how successful their creation was becoming. But then the final straw came. They had pitched the idea of Superboy to DC, and DC had rejected it. But then, while Siegel's back was turned, they produced Superboy comics with other writers without his permission. And by his back was turned, I mean he was off fighting in World War II. So after getting back from winning World War II, Siegel and Shuster were pretty pissed and took DC to court to try and regain control of both Superman and Superboy. The judge ruled that Superman was owned by DC, but Superboy was owned by Siegel and Shuster, and they got a big payout from DC, along with getting fired. They would take DC to court again in the 70s and lose again. Their legal fights, combined with an industry blacklist for their repeated efforts to try and take back their creations, had left them both destitute by the mid-1970s. Thankfully, Siegel's press release worked. DC agreed to pay each of them a yearly stipend of $20,000 for the rest of their lives if they stopped coming after the copyright. Perhaps that's not all they deserve, but it was enough to get them to stop complaining. But the story doesn't end there, because a year after that press release, US copyright law was amended and a cancellation ability was introduced. At certain intervals during the 100-year life of a copyright, creators are allowed to take back their copyright. This was put in specifically for cases like Superman, where creation turns out to be way more valuable than anyone had at first expected. And after many years of making money off the copyright, the company is forced to renegotiate with the original creator. And while that law came into effect too late for Siegel and Shuster, in 2001, Siegel's heirs used that clause and took back Superman. They quickly sold the rights back to DC in a lucrative deal, finally providing something close to fair compensation for the work Siegel and Shuster had done nearly 70 years earlier. So you're smart. If it's so easy to cancel a copyright, why doesn't everybody do it? That brings us to battle number 2. In 2009, the family of Jack Kirby sent out copyright termination notices to the big companies for the characters he created. Now, you may know that Jack Kirby is the king of creating characters, so his family had to send out 45 of these notices. In response to the termination notices, Marvel acquiesced and paid Jack Kirby's family a nice big sum of money. Just kidding, Marvel sued them. You see, there's a funny exception to copyright termination law, and that's called work for hire. A creator can never terminate a work for hire agreement. Now, work for hire gets a bad rap, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's designed for creators who are working as full-time employees of a company towards a collective creative work. For instance, writing code for a software company or working on a movie. Marvel claimed that Jack Kirby's work was work for hire, done at the company's expense and under the company's direction. Kirby's family claimed he worked as a freelance creative in his home under his own direction and at his own own expense, and Marvel merely published his work. Comics, especially ones set in a shared universe, sit in this weird gray area between something like a novel, which is clearly an individual work, and a movie, which is clearly collaborative. And the court struggled with this, at each level of the legal system making opposite decisions on whether it was work for hire or not. Finally, in 2014, the Kirby case was on its way to the Supreme Court, and Marvel got scared. They ended up settling with the Kirby family for a reported $30 to $50 million. Yay, finally a story with a victory for creators. Except maybe not, because since then, Marvel has used the Kirby case as precedent that all of the work done during that period was work made for hire. In 2021, Marvel sued Stan Lee's brother Larry Lieber, along with Gene Colan, Don Heck, and a bunch of other legendary comic creators and their families to stop them from canceling their copyrights. Now, you might not know the name Steve Gerber, possibly because he was booted from Marvel because he tried to sue them for control of Howard the Duck, which is also a way better comic than you're probably imagining. Gerber claimed that he had never assigned the copyright to Marvel. Marvel claimed that he had, and they had evidence. The back of his check. That's right, in the 70s, Marvel started printing contracts on the back of creators' checks, so it was physically impossible for them to endorse their check and deposit it without turning over their copyright to Marvel. This is the actual check that Gerber apparently sold Howard the Duck to Marvel for. It's for $285. Like all of these cases, the Gerber case is a complex one that I'm dramatically oversimplifying, with lots at issue besides one check. But I think what's telling is that when Gerber needed help to raise the money for his fight with Marvel, who came to his side? Jack Kirby. Together they produced Destroyer Duck, a parody of Marvel and Howard that was sold to raise funds for his case. A bunch of other comic legends came to Gerber's side, but he ended up settling with Marvel and reportedly spent the rest of his life dogged by the legal costs. And the costs and risks of going against a big company is a real issue here. Gary Friedrich, the co-creator of Ghost Rider, also sued Marvel over his work during this period, and not only did he lose because of the contract on the back of his check, Marvel sued him back for selling unauthorized Ghost Rider merchandise at conventions, and he was ordered to pay them $17,000 in damages, which, combined with his legal costs, left him destitute for the few remaining years of his life, dependent on the support of the comic community. But now it's the 80s and everyone is wised up. Creators have become well informed about what has happened to their peers over the past few decades. DC saw this as a PR opportunity and started to offer better terms for creators, and I think that many of the people at the company were sincere in their efforts. The poster boy for that initiative was Alan Moore. He was on a hot streak at DC, and he's come out with a tiny little comic called Watchmen. And not only is he paid well for Watchmen, but he gets a reversion clause in his contract, saying that once DC is done with the Watchmen characters and hasn't used them for a year, the rights go back to Moore, and he can do with them whatever he wants. Well, funny thing about Watchmen, DC has never stopped printing it. Since 1986, they've printed new copies each year, so the rights have never gone back to Moore. Totally legal, but he felt swindled by the whole thing and refused to work with DC ever again. Which brings us to today. We've ironed out the kinks, and finally both Marvel and DC give creators clear work for hire agreements, and they also get an incentive program if their characters become successful. Now, because we live in the age of the NDA, it's a bit hard to get concrete info on these contracts, but reportedly, that program leaves a little bit to be desired. For Marvel, if a character appears in a movie, the creator gets a $5,000 check and a thank you. And on top of that, both companies unilaterally decide whether a character is original enough to be considered an original creation. Famously, DC writer Jerry Conway created Power Girl, but he was recently denied royalties because they decided she was just derivative of Superman. Was this the case with Winter Soldier, who is a reinterpretation of a character co-created by Jack Kirby? This is where the idea of a shared universe gets really confusing. When a character is part of the shared universe, how do you assign the right amount of credit and money to everyone involved in building that universe? I sympathize with the companies that have to figure that out, but I think it's important that they do. Look, we've come a long way from the days when Bob Kane took Bill Finger's idea for Batman and sold it to DC and never admitted that he got his ideas from Finger until after his death, but I believe there's still room to grow. We all want the same thing, which is fair treatment for creators as well as for the companies that make their work possible, even if we won't always agree on what the best solution looks like. Finally, consider donating to the Hero Initiative, which helps pay the bills for struggling comic creators. It's crazy that it has to exist, but it's a good cause that you can help out today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please hit the like and subscribe buttons and leave a comment down below.